34 years ago, dozens of children disappeared during a school field trip. No bodies, no answers, just silence. The school closed, records vanished, and the case faded into obscurity. But when one forgotten diary surfaced, it exposed a detail no one had dared to question. What followed would uncover a truth darker than anyone was prepared to face. Snow was falling again. Outside the window, the sky darkened, the last light of day swallowed by thick clouds and the east wind sweeping through the skeletal pines. In the old log cabin, a lone figure sat silently in the corner of the living room, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, her gaze unfocused, as if lost in a distant realm of memory where only the faint echoes of time remained. Laura Carter, 50 years old, had lived alone in this house for nearly 3 decades. It was left to her by her parents, situated about 6 miles from town, deep in a forest that no one bothered to visit anymore. The dark wooden ceiling, the red brick fireplace, and the old sofa still faintly scented with licorice, all remained unchanged since 1974. But what truly hadn't changed was the silence. A peculiar kind of silence, not born of a lack of people, but because something had vanished, never to return. On the wall to the right of the fireplace hung a family photograph taken in the summer of 1966. Her parents, Laura at 15, and Emma, the brown-haired, bright-eyed 12-year-old, stood beside her, wrinkling their noses in silly grins like any children up to mischief. Emma was a mischievous, stubborn girl with a vivid imagination. She used to say odd things like, "Laura, I feel like someone's watching us from the woods," or, "I dreamed there was a car with no windows parked in the schoolyard." Back then, Laura just laughed it off. Now, those words clung to her mind like puzzle pieces that never quite fit. Then, in 1967, after a school field trip, Emma never came back. Laura rarely spoke about it directly to anyone. When asked, which was infrequent, she would simply reply, "It happened a long time ago." And so, the story retreated into the shadows. But every time she looked at that photograph, she knew that time had done little more than seal a wound. Today, like every winter afternoon, Laura made tea. She still made 2 cups, one for herself, and one placed next to Emma's photo. Not because she believed in spirits or anything supernatural, but because to her, Emma had never truly left. The little girl was still around somewhere, in the draft that snaked through the window, in the scratchy old record that played every morning, or in that second cup of tea, cooling like a memory, but never quite gone. Once, a neighbor, old Fred, stopped by with a pumpkin pie and casually asked, "Why do you keep everything exactly the same? I think you should change things a bit, start a new life." Laura simply smiled faintly. She had no answer that anyone would understand. The fireplace crackled. The room warmed slightly. Laura raised the tea to her lips, slowly taking a sip. Her hand instinctively touched the neatly folded woolen scarf on the armchair, Emma's scarf. The smell of old fabric, a hint of dampness and dust. Laura lifted it, pressing it to her cheek. On winter days like this, she and Emma would sit together by the fireplace, telling ghost stories and giggling late into the night. That happened 27 years ago, but the feeling of loss, it remained, as cold as the snow on the porch and as deep as the emptiness on the seat beside her. That evening, as Laura was folding laundry, a knock echoed at the door. A single knock, light and brief. She frowned, quietly opening the door. A gust of cold air hit her face, bringing with it a white envelope lying in the doorway. No one was there. Only swirling snow. Laura bent down and picked it up. The ink was slightly smudged from the dampness, but the words were clear. "You're invited to the 50th anniversary reunion for former students of Rose Hill Elementary School. Emma's school, and hers too." Laura slumped into a chair. The school had been dissolved in 1969. No one ever mentioned it. She thought it had died along with the memories of that year. She placed the letter on the table, her hand trembling slightly. The wind howled harder outside the window. For a moment, she felt as if she were no longer in the present, but back on that night when her mother ran into the street, sobbing, and her father held Laura's hand tightly, repeating, "Be strong, sweetheart. Everything will be all right." Laura had never forgotten. She just lived with it, like living with a scar that couldn't be touched, but still ached dully. Finally, she stood up, slowly walked to the photograph on the wall, and wiped away the thin layer of dust with her sleeve. Emma's eyes, through the black and white lens, seemed to look directly at her sister. Laura whispered, "I never stopped waiting for you to come home, Em. Where did you go?" The winter sun rose weakly, like a dying ember. The light wasn't enough to melt the frost, only turning the thin layer of ice on the window, a pale pink, shimmering like smeared paint. Laura plugged in the kettle, twisting the knob 3 times before hearing the faint click, indicating the water was heating. Every morning of hers started like this, from small, repetitive actions, but like a fragile thread keeping her alive. She ate breakfast with toast, spreading a little raspberry jam, a habit left over from the days when her mother was still around. On the table, the invitation from the previous night remained untouched. The paper was slightly curled from the cold. She hadn't opened it, not because she didn't want to know what was inside, but because she feared the names. Some names, when read aloud, not only evoked memories, but awakened, buried screams. After breakfast, Laura put on a thick coat and walked down to town as usual, a journey of nearly 4 kilometers through the forest. Snow covered the path, each of her footsteps creating a white indentation, stretching far into the distance like the traces of someone with nowhere to go, only a place to return to. The town of Fair Meadow was as sad in winter as a diary forgotten in a drawer. The shops closed early. The gas station only had 1 employee on duty, burning coal inside to keep warm. No one was in a hurry. No one asked questions. People were familiar with the image of Laura Carter, the woman who walked every morning, didn't chat, didn't visit the market, only stopped at the old bookstore on Maple Street. The owner, Mrs. Agnes, was a widow in her 70s. Seeing Laura, she smiled, nodding in greeting. "Still looking for old books?" she asked, her eyes fixed on a book she was arranging on the shelf. Laura nodded. "It helps me keep my mind sharp." Today, she chose a book about the history of education in Vermont, not because she was passionate, nor for any reason, just a topic to help her forget her painful reality. When paying, Agnes lowered her voice. "I heard they're planning a Rose Hill reunion." Laura looked up. The old woman continued, "I don't plan to attend. But if you go, maybe you should prepare yourself. There are people you thought you'd forgotten, but they remember you more clearly than you think." Laura didn't answer, only smiled faintly and left the shop, holding the book to her chest like the last warmth of the cold morning. In the afternoon, Laura visited the cemetery at the edge of town. There, her parents rested in a small corner. Gravestones made of gray stone, the inscriptions worn away. Beside her father's grave was an empty space, no headstone, no flowers, only a small round stone placed as if accidentally forgotten. Laura herself had put it there, 10 years after Emma disappeared. "She'll have a place of her own," she had told her mother, but until the day her mother died, there was no clue of Emma at all. "No body, no grave," she said. "Then there's no such thing as closure." Now, Laura didn't know whether she agreed or disagreed. She sat down by the small stone, gently brushing the snow off the surface. Silence stretched out. She pulled a small tea bag from her pocket and placed it on the ground. "I made tea for you this morning. You didn't drink it, so I brought it down here." She smiled, her lips dry and cracked, then laughed at herself. For a long time, Laura had been used to one-way conversations. Not because she was crazy, but because if she kept silent for too long, if she didn't fill that emptiness with words, she would go insane. That evening, Laura returned home and opened the invitation. Her eyes scanned each line, stopping at a name, Martha Elkins, Class 6B, confirmed attendance. Her heart skipped a beat. Martha, Emma's best friend, also attended the field trip that year. She was one of the few survivors who didn't disappear, but also the person who, after 1967, never mentioned Emma once. Laura had repeatedly tried to ask Martha about Emma's information, but all she received was silence and evasion. Then she chose to be silent, because she thought that perhaps Martha had her own suffering. But now, after so many years of living in silence, Laura felt she couldn't keep quiet. She walked to the table, opened the drawer, and took out the group photo from 1967, Emma's class photo. 18 small faces, grinning, standing in the schoolyard. Laura flipped the photo over. On the back, her father had written, Class 6B photo, March 1967. She counted the number of students, 18. But in her memory, the field trip had at least 39 people, including students from other classes, teachers, and drivers. So, where were the other kids? Why were there no photos? Why did everyone disappear in silence? Laura whispered. I didn't notice. All these years, I let these things lie still without looking closely. The photo trembled slightly in her hand, not because of the cold, but because for the first time, after 34 years, she began to doubt what she had always believed to be true. 2 in the morning, Laura was still awake. She sat at the wooden desk in the small office, which used to be Emma's study. The light from the dim yellow desk lamp created a hazy area in the room shrouded in darkness. On the desk was the class photo that she had just discovered was unusual. Next to it were notebooks, notes, and a small magnifying glass. Laura had never used it since high school, but now it was the tool she trusted most. She began marking each face in the photo, writing names from memory. Some faces were clear in her mind. Martha with her curly hair, the snub-nosed boy Jimmy who always played pranks in class, and Emma herself, standing in the front row, leaning slightly towards Laura, as if wanting to say something she hadn't had time to say. There were only 18 children. The field trip that year, according to the memory that Laura had confirmed by digging up a few old newspaper clippings in the town library, had at least 36 students participating, and the remaining children were completely absent from the photo. Why? That question was like a thorn stuck in her mind. Laura knew she needed to verify it. She left the desk, took the family document box in the wooden cabinet, where her mother used to keep all the documents related to her 2 sisters' studies. She rummaged through report cards, letters, invitations to parents, certificates. Everything was still complete. But when Laura looked for the field trip plan in 1967, she discovered something strange. There was no copy of the organization permit or even the application form. There was only a notice printed in purple ink, without an official signature, without the school seal, stating, Class 6 students will participate in a field trip at Moonlight Point Campground, May 5, 1967. At the bottom was the typewritten line, sponsored by the Eastern Humanitarian Education Society. Laura sat up straight. Eastern Humanitarian Education Society. She had never heard of that name. Emma's school was a public school. All extracurricular activities were organized by the district. It was completely unusual for a private association to sponsor such a large-scale trip. And even stranger, there were no official records to accompany it. Laura wrote the name in her notebook and opened her computer, connecting to the slow network. She searched for Eastern Humanitarian Education Society. No clear results appeared. A few links led to defunct charities, some vague, disjointed documents. But when she searched using the French keyword Ordinem Humanitatis Orientalis, the Latin translation of the name above, a PDF document appeared from an old archive page. Post-war report, Suspicions about Transnational Educational Organizations, 1946 to 1972. She opened it, her heart beating fast. Page 17 stated, several organizations under the guise of education, such as Ordinem Humanitatis Orientalis, were suspected of being involved in the selection and transportation of minors from the United States to Europe in the form of cultural exchange scholarships. Below that was a blurry image with the caption, "Group symbol, 3 interlocking circles, symbolizing the link between 3 continents." Laura's hand stiffened. 3 circles. The drawing was exactly the same as the symbol she had seen in Emma's diary. She turned back to the table, reopened the small leather diary, which she had discovered in the old photo frame. At the end of the 3rd page in purple ink, Emma had written, "Don't trust the people who dress like teachers. They're not like anyone. They ask me strange questions. I don't think they're American." Laura clutched the notebook tightly. Emma was only 12 years old at the time, but she had sensed something unusual, had wanted to leave a sign. She lit another candle, placing it next to the documents and notebooks. The candlelight flickered on the wall, printing on the family photo. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Laura felt that the truth lay not in what people denied, but in the small details that everyone ignored. The next morning, she drove to the county library, where old local newspapers, administrative records, and dissolved school libraries were stored. Here, she found the student list from 1966 to 1967 of Rose Hill School. In the archived print, under a thick layer of dust, she saw the names of Class 6B, Emma Carter, Martha Elkins, Jimmy Fields, a total of 21 students. So the class photo only had 18 people. Where were the other 3? Laura scanned the names. One of them was Emily Reese. That name was familiar. She looked up a small news item in the local newspaper printed in June 1967, in the notice section. The Reese family said their daughter Emily Reese has been missing since May 5th. Police are still searching. If you have any clues, please contact... There was no update after that, no announcement, no conclusion. Just missing. Then silence. Laura leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. Not just Emma. At least 4 children went missing on the same day. But only her family continued to search. The others either were forced to be silent or chose to forget. She wrote down the names of those children in her notebook. After the name Emily Reese, she added 3 dots, not because of a lack of information, but because that was the line, where the story was no longer just about Emma. Laura had never liked the town of Fair Meadow, but had never hated it as much as now. On the way to the nursing home at the end of town, where Mrs. Agatha Winthrop, the former principal of Rose Hill School, was living, Laura felt her heart tighten with each beat. Not because she feared the answer, but because of the fear that no one would dare to say anything. Mrs. Winthrop was nearly 90 years old this year, not as lucid as before. But she was the last surviving member of the board of directors, and the person who signed the field trip confirmation in 1967. At least, on the paper Laura found in the family file, there was her signature. Although there was no official seal, she arrived at the institute at 9 a.m. The atmosphere in the building was cold and quiet. The old people sat by the window, staring at the falling snow as if waiting for something unnamed. The nurse led her into a small room on the 2nd floor. The room was simply decorated. A single bed, an old bookshelf, and a few family photos placed on the cabinet. Mrs. Agatha sat in a wheelchair, her silver hair as thin as smoke, her eyes dull but still retaining the strictness of someone who used to give orders. When Laura entered, she raised her head, her eyes swept over like a cold wind. "You are?" "I'm Laura Carter," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "My sister is Emma Carter, Class 6B, Rose Hill School. Do you remember?" A moment of silence. Mrs. Winthrop's eyes narrowed. "Emma." She repeated the name. "Carter. Oh my, how many years has it been?" "Do you remember the field trip in 1967? Laura asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. The old woman was silent for a long time. Then she slowly replied, "I remember. There was a trip. But the records were burned. The police said it was an accident. No records were sent to the superiors, you know that," Laura said directly. "No student list, no accompanying teachers. No one is willing to confirm anything. Why, Mrs. Winthrop?" The question fell into the air like a stone thrown into a frozen lake. Mrs. Winthrop gripped the arm of the wheelchair tightly. After a while, she quietly said, "It's not that I don't know, Miss Carter. But some things, the deeper you dig, the more dangerous. You should leave it alone." "Emma is my sister," Laura choked. "She disappeared. You know what happened. At least, tell me why the school allowed that to happen." Mrs. Winthrop didn't answer immediately. Both fell silent, only the ticking clock from the wall behind. Then finally, the old woman said softly, like a person confessing a sin that she didn't fully understand. "They came very properly, with papers. Said they represented an exchange scholarship program. Sponsored the field trip as an assessment of candidates. They wore vests, spoke politely. There were even letters of introduction from an office in Washington. Did you verify it?" "At that time, I didn't know how to verify it. And you know, back then, people believed papers from the government like the Bible." "Government?" Laura was stunned. "Are you talking about what agency?" "No specific name," she shook her head. "Only the symbol. O-N-E. I remember because it's like the word one in English." Laura went numb. O-N-E. Ordinum Noctis Educatio. She had seen this symbol once in the old PDF last night. "You let people of unknown identity take students away?" Her voice rose. "And you thought it was a scholarship?" Mrs. Winthrop looked at Laura as if she was looking at herself in the past, younger, more confident, but no less helpless. "Do you think I haven't asked myself that for the past 30 years? She said, trembling. "Do you think I haven't dreamed of the children calling my name as they sink into the ground?" Laura couldn't answer. She just stood still, clutching the edge of her coat. "After that," she continued, "people came. Not the police, not the press. It was the people from the district. They told us not to speak. That everything would be handled. And then, the archive burned down. A month later, the school was closed. That thing never existed." She turned her face away, her voice completely lost. "Do you think I don't know I was silent because I was afraid? I'm afraid. Very afraid." Leaving the nursing home, Laura sat in the car for a long time without starting it. Outside, snow began to fall again. Not too thick, but cold and persistent like a memory that couldn't be shaken off. "Silent because of fear," she repeated Mrs. Winthrop's words. Every adult in the story of the past chose to be silent, a kind of evasion cloaked in morality that they didn't know everything, just followed instructions. But they stood and watched the children get on the bus and never return. And now, only she, a sister who never had a chance to say goodbye, was following the traces that adults should have been the first to keep. She turned the car around, driving to the next address, a small wooden house on the edge of the lake where Mr. Michael Truss, who used to be the bus driver in charge of the student group in 1967, was now living with his daughter. Laura had never met him, but his name had appeared in a small thank-you note printed in the newspaper in April 1967. "Thank you, Mr. Truss, for volunteering to take the students to Moonlight Point." "Mr. Truss is very forgetful now," his daughter said, opening the door to welcome Laura. "But if you want to ask about the old days, luckily he may still remember some things." Inside, the house was cozy, with the smell of mint and eucalyptus oil. Mr. Truss sat on an armchair, thin, with white hair, his eyes deep but still shining with alertness when Laura introduced herself. "Emma Carter," he murmured, "the girl sitting in the third row from the top." Laura's heart tightened. "Do you remember anything strange that day?" she asked. Mr. Truss looked out the window, his eyes gradually drifting away. Then he said a sentence that Laura would never forget. "I never saw the children come back." Laura continued her investigation. She walked into the long hallway of the State Mental Rehabilitation Center with sweaty palms. She had hesitated for 3 days before calling to confirm the identity of the patient, who the attending physician called Tom Briggs, born in 1955, a former student of Rose Hill School. "Tommy Briggs," Emma's classmate, one of the last children confirmed to have returned after the fateful trip in 1967. But he was never a boy again, only a man with chronic mental disorders, living in the darkness of memories that no one bothered to believe. The nurse led Laura into a simple room. Single bed, barred windows, small wooden table, and bookshelf. The man was sitting at the table, his back slightly hunched, his hair graying early. He didn't turn around when he heard the door open. "Mr. Briggs," Laura said. "I'm Laura Carter." That name made the atmosphere freeze for a moment. The man slowly turned his head, his dull eyes stopping at her as if trying to find a face he once knew. "Carter," he repeated slowly. "Your sister is Emma." "Yes," Laura replied, her heart pounding. "Emma, my sister. You were in the same class as her back then." Silence stretched out. Tommy bowed his head, his arms tightening slightly. "You came to ask about that?" he asked, as if he had just heard a taboo. "No one asks me anymore. It's been a long time." "I don't want to hurt you," Laura said softly. "But I need to know. I need to hear from someone who was there." Tommy pointed to the chair opposite. Laura sat down. "At first, I don't remember," he began, his voice deep and turbid. "I only remember colors. The blue of Emma's shirt, the gray sand under my feet, and the red of the moonlight. The moon is never as red as that, is it?" Laura didn't answer. She let him speak, as if afraid that interrupting would break the fragile stream of memories that had just emerged. "They said they would take us to see the ecological camp, but the car didn't drive towards the mountain. It went into the forest, deeper and deeper. No signs, no trails. We weren't allowed to look out. The windows were covered." "What about Emma?" Laura asked softly. Tommy pursed his lips, then said slowly, "Emma sat next to me. At first, she played with my hair. She said, 'This must be a real camp because no one knows this way.' Then she laughed. But after that, he put his hands to his head as if a painful piece of memory had just stabbed him." Laura didn't interrupt. "They divided us into groups, separated. Each one was called by name. Emma was called early. I didn't see her anymore. No one saw her. That night, I heard someone crying, a child's voice. Not one, but many. Emma's voice? Not sure, but there was a voice, light, very light, calling someone's name. Maybe it was you." He looked at Laura. Maybe it was Laura. I don't dare to believe it. She bit her lip tightly, her breath caught in her chest. "They locked us in a room underground, no windows. Every time a child was called away, it didn't come back." "How did you escape?" Tommy was silent for a long time before speaking. "I didn't escape. They left me behind. I don't know why. Maybe because I had a seizure. I used to have mild epilepsy when I was young. They didn't want to risk it. One day, when I woke up, everyone had disappeared. The room fell silent. Laura felt like she was sinking into a thick lake where each of Tommy's stories was a stone falling to the bottom, slow, heavy, and without echo. I tried to tell the police. They took notes, then didn't call back. A week later, someone came to the house, told my parents that I was delusional. They sent me here. They didn't investigate?" Tommy laughed dryly. "No one wanted to hear about a child saying the teachers aren't real people." Laura took his hand. "I believe you. I don't think you're crazy. I think you survived, and they wanted that survival to be silent." Tommy looked down at her hand. His old eyes suddenly sparkled like morning dew. "I used to think someone would find it again, but I'm too tired. My voice has been forgotten." "No," Laura shook her head. "Your voice is the last surviving piece, and it's being heard." Before leaving the institute, Tommy gave her a bundle of old papers, wrapped tightly with a rubber band. Inside was a cassette tape with faded letters, along with a folded piece of paper. "I secretly took it from one of them. It has Emma's name on it. I don't dare to listen. But maybe you should. Laura took the tape home. That night, she rummaged through her father's old cassette player, which had been dusty for many years. The machine still worked. She put the tape in, pressed play. A crackling sound rang out. Then a girl's voice rang out, as thin as a spider's web in the dew. If anyone hears this, I'm Emma Carter. I'm 12 years old. I'm going with Rose Hill School to Moonlight Point, but this isn't a camp. The sound of swallowing. The voice trembled more. Laura, if you find this, I miss you. Miss Mom. I don't know if I can come back. But if I don't come back, don't forget me. Please. Bending down, Laura put her forehead on the table, covering her mouth to stop the sobs. She had no more tears to shed. Only intermittent breaths and a single whisper echoed in her head. Oh, my little sister. When Laura arrived at Moonlight Point, it was late afternoon. The old campsite, once a place for Rose Hill students to experience nature, was now just a desolate, decaying area, swallowed by the forest long ago. The old wooden sign was broken, lying hidden in the tall grass, the words, Moonlight Point Recreation Area, only a few readable characters, the paint peeling off, as if deliberately erased by time. Laura parked her car on the side of the road, squeezed through the broken fence, and walked deep into the forest. In her hand was an old satellite map that she downloaded from a local archaeological forum, which had aerial photos taken before the camp was abandoned. On the map was marked a small circle, the location believed to be the central campsite. The sound of dry branches crackling under her feet, the air heavy with the smell of damp soil and fallen leaves. But what made Laura shudder was the absolute silence, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, watching her every step. She stopped when she saw the ground was flatter, the grass shorter, as if someone had lived here. A cracked cement slab protruded from the soil, possibly the foundation of an old building, a warehouse, or a field kitchen. She stood silently for a few minutes, listening. No wind, no birds. The forest seemed to be frozen in an invisible layer of glass. Laura bent down, picked up a small stone, and threw it into the bushes. Not a squirrel ran out, not a branch swayed. Then suddenly she realized something was wrong. The ground where she stood was slightly recessed, not naturally, but as if something had been buried here and had collapsed slightly over time. She bent down, pressing her hand lightly. The soil was softer than other places. That feeling was familiar. It was exactly how her father had shown her how to check for rat nests in the garden years ago. Her hand began to dig with a pointed stick. Each layer of soil brushed away was a heavier layer lifted from her heart. About a few minutes later, she touched a piece of rotten wood. She stopped, her heart beating fast, holding her breath to listen. But there was still no sound other than her own breath. She pried the board to one side, and the smell of mold flooded up, a mixture of soil, old metal, and something like old engine oil. Under the board was an empty space, about half a meter deep, revealing a rusty red pipe, bent as if it had been connected to a system. A shelter? An old technical room? Laura trembled slightly, not because of fear, but because she knew she was in the right place. She swept the flashlight across the cement floor, walking towards the end of the yard. Where the ground was sunken, it seemed to have been the camping area. An old tree trunk was cut horizontally, lying crooked, its roots protruding like broken arms. Next to it, under the roots, she discovered a small opening, like a way down to something below. Her heart beating fast, she shone the light into the crevice. Below was a small iron box. It took nearly 10 minutes of digging with her bare hands to get it up. The box was rusty, with a latch, but not too secure. Using a knife to pry it open, the box popped open. Inside were things that made Laura unable to breathe for the first few seconds. A small silver bracelet engraved with E. Carter, a piece of light blue fabric like a hair ribbon, a piece of old paper smudged with ink written in slanted handwriting. I love Mom and Dad. I love you so much. Laura hugged the box to her chest. Her whole body trembled. The night wind whistled through the branches, but she could no longer hear anything. Her ears only heard her own sobs. Emma was here, had known she might not come back. When Laura looked up, darkness had thickened. She turned on the flashlight, but the light faded. The battery ran out faster than expected. She hurried back, not daring to linger in the cold forest. But before she got to the car, she looked up at the sky and stood still. The moon tonight was not white, but red-orange, a rare astronomical phenomenon in winter. In her diary, Emma had written, "If I don't come back, find the place with the red moon." At that time, Laura thought it was just a random sentence from an imaginative child. But now, it was a real guide. The red moon covered the wasteland, shining on the metal, the iron box, and the small pieces of evidence of a 12-year-old child who had disappeared from the world. Laura stood still for a long time, as if wanting to let the moonlight engrave this image into her memory, as a promise to herself. I have come. I have seen. And I will find you again. Before leaving, Laura did something she didn't know why she was doing, as if someone inside her urged her. She returned to the land, picked up 3 flat stones, and arranged them into 3 interlocking circles, right next to the fallen tree trunk. A symbol. Not to mark, but to remind. Someone was here, and someone else has returned. Then she pulled a piece of white cloth from her pocket, torn from a handkerchief. Using a ballpoint pen, she wrote on it, "Emma, I heard you." She tied the piece of cloth to the nearest branch, letting it sway under the red moon, like a bell that doesn't make a sound, but echoes to the deepest place of memory. As Laura's footsteps left the forest, each branch behind her swayed slightly. Not because of the wind, but perhaps because memory also knows how to tremble when awakened. 3 days after leaving Moonlight Point, Laura returned to the log cabin in the forest with soil-stained hands and a small iron box trembling in her backpack. She hadn't slept a wink all night because her mind kept replaying what she had found. The bracelet engraved with her sister's name, the piece of paper written in childish handwriting, and another piece of paper, the most important one, folded 3 times, tucked behind the box lining, seemingly to hide it from the first glance. The paper only had one line, Steinbach, Haus der Einkehr. Below was the code, 671-E/AT, along with the symbol of 3 interlocking circles. Laura looked it up. Steinbach was the name of a small village in Austria. Haus der Einkehr used to be a monastery located deep in the Tyrol Mountains, now closed and removed from all tourist maps. But the small pieces of information she found from post-war document archive forums indicated that this used to be a temporary stop for exchange student groups from the United States to Europe, most active from 1950 to the late 60s, completely coinciding with the time Emma disappeared. Not coincidental. Impossible. Laura looked at the old photo of Emma on the table, the little girl's eyes shining as if she always knew more than she ever said. "You left an address," she said quietly, "and now I will go find it." The Austrian air in February was skin-cutting cold. As soon as the plane landed at Innsbruck Airport, Laura felt the cold air penetrate her thick coat. From the glass door of the station, she saw the snow-covered mountains quietly sleeping as if forgotten from the last century. But what made her shiver was not the cold, but the vague feeling that she was entering a place that Emma had never left. Laura rented a small car, driving nearly 3 hours through the mountain roads, stopping at a small village called Steinbach, just a few dozen houses nestled on the mountainside. The people were gentle, sparsely populated, speaking a difficult-to-understand dialect of German, but when she mentioned Haus der Einkehr, their eyes changed color. An old man sweeping snow dropped his broom, quietly pointing to a small trail leading up the hill. "No one is there anymore, but you will see. The old things are still there." Laura nodded, thanked him, and walked away. The monastery was isolated in the old pine forest. The moss-covered stone steps led to a 2-story building made of gray stone, with a pointed roof and closed wooden doors. There was no bell, no sign. But when she put her hand on the old wooden door, it suddenly opened, as if it had been waiting for someone for a long time. Inside was as cold as an ice cellar. The long hallway was carpeted with worn carpets, with faded religious paintings hanging on both sides. The smell of dampness and rotten wood mixed with something hard to name, perhaps the smell of secrets that were never confessed. Laura called out, in both English and German. No one answered. She walked deeper in, through an old prayer room, then to an empty kitchen. At the end of the hall, a low wooden door opened slightly. A hoarse voice echoed, "Are you American?" Laura hesitated. "Yes. I came to find out about Haus der Einkehr, about a little girl named Emma Carter, in 1967. The old voice went silent for a moment, then replied, "I thought no one remembered anymore." The man's name was Otto, over 80 years old, the last monk who had lived at the monastery when it was still in operation. Now, he was no longer a monk, just the caretaker of the building to keep it from completely collapsing. They sat in a small room with a dying fireplace. Otto made tea with trembling hands. On the table was an old Bible, next to it a locked wooden box. He kept his hand on it throughout the conversation, like a last protective object. There was a little girl named Emma, small, brown hair, very polite, he began, his eyes looking far away. She was brought here in a group of 11 children from America, June of 1967. "Brought here to do what?" Laura asked. Otto paused. "I don't know exactly. They didn't say. They only said this was the final transfer. But I remember clearly, that child was not like the others. She asked questions, piqued. She wasn't well behaved in the way they liked." "Who were they?" Laura emphasized. "They were people who didn't wear monastic robes but always gave orders as if they were acting in the name of God. They gave the children medicine, said it was vitamins. But I saw Emma didn't drink it. She hid the pill in her hand." "And then?" Laura whispered. Otto bowed his head. His voice almost broke. "On the second night, there was a scream. When I arrived, the door was locked. The next morning, Emma didn't wake up anymore. They said it was a drug overdose, but I know." Laura didn't ask further. She understood. "The little girl never woke up," Otto whispered. "They wrapped her up like a bag of things, no mass, no prayer, and took her away. No one knows where she was buried. Maybe not buried." Otto stood up, walked to the corner of the room. He pulled out a small painting, the wooden frame rotten, the canvas stained with dried blood. In the middle of the painting was the image of 3 intersecting circles, drawn with trembling hands. At the bottom was a Latin inscription written in blood, "Ad sanguinem silentium." Silence, until the blood runs dry. Otto said, "This was drawn by another little girl before being transferred, maybe also from America. I kept it. No one found out." Laura choked. She didn't know what she felt in the face of that scene. Indignation, fear, or just a pain too great for even emotions to speak. Finally, Otto opened the wooden box. Inside were a few pieces of paper, a broken crucifix, and a handwritten letter in English. "If anyone remembers my name, please tell that I once lived. I am Emma Carter. I am 12 years old. I don't want to be forgotten. I don't want to be a number. I am human." Laura didn't cry, but her hand clenched into a fist, trembling. Emma had left everything she could, traces, voice, writing, as if she had foreseen that she would be erased from the world. And now, her sister was sitting in the same room, holding the last letter that her sister had left, and understood that. Telling this story was no longer a choice. It was an obligation. Laura returned to America on a gray morning in early March. Everything was the same old roads, the hazy sky, and the town of Fair Meadow immersed in immutable habits. But to her, every look, every tree branch, every car horn had a different weight. because now she was no longer someone living with memories, but someone holding in her hand the proof that those memories were true. In her suitcase was the wooden box from Austria, containing Emma's handwritten letter, the piece of ribbon, and the blood painting with the symbol of 3 circles. Each object was a small voice of the souls that had been swallowed by the nameless system, and now were demanding to be remembered. She spent 2 days rearranging everything, printing documents, scanning images, taking notes, stringing together timelines. She called the local newspaper, emailed television stations, sent copies to human rights organizations and the state prosecutor's office. Some didn't respond. Some promised to consider. Then she waited and realized the truth doesn't create its own echo. One gloomy afternoon, she was invited to the county police headquarters. A young detective named Ellison received her in a small meeting room. He looked through the thick file Laura brought, frowning. "Miss Carter, I believe your pain is real, but let's be clear. This is a case more than 30 years ago. The statute of limitations has expired. The organizations mentioned no longer exist legally. And so, what are we going to do?" Laura looked straight at him, not angry, but very cold. "Wait another 30 years until no one is alive to remember?" Ellison was embarrassed. He tapped his hand on the table. "We can transfer the file to the Historical Crime Archive, or propose a humanitarian investigation that is not prosecutable." But it will die in a drawer," she finished for him. "Like Emma, like the other children, and once again, no one will be held responsible." Ellison didn't deny it. He just said softly, "Sometimes justice doesn't catch up with memory, but that doesn't mean memory isn't important." Laura stood up. She nodded. "Thank you, but I don't need permission to tell the truth." The next day, Laura returned to the old house and began to write. Not a lawsuit, not an investigation, but a book. The title was simple. Her name is Emma. She wrote not as a writer, but as a sister who had waited 30 years to hear her sister speak. And now she would use her own voice to return that voice. She wrote about Emma, not as a victim, but as a human being. She recounted the evenings of telling ghost stories, the times the 2 sisters sneaked out from their parents to catch fireflies, the last time Emma giggled because she had stuffed a whole cookie in her mouth. Then she wrote about the day Emma disappeared, about the long years after that, about the blue ribbon, about Moonlight Point, about the letter in the monastery. Each page written was like turning over a dust-covered cloth, exposing what had been hidden. She sent the manuscript to 10 publishers. 7 refused. 1 read and not suitable. 2 didn't answer. Besides the silent emails, Laura also received a strange call from a young editor of an independent cultural magazine. "We don't have the budget to print books, but we have a section on untold stories. If you allow it, I want to excerpt the first chapter." The girl's voice echoed on the phone, hesitant but earnest. Laura didn't expect much, but 2 weeks later, the magazine was published. A small corner inside published the opening section of Laura's book, the part Emma wrote in her diary about the red moon. 3 days later, Laura received 12 emails from strangers, a handwritten letter, and 2 phone calls. They were not witnesses, nor did they know Emma, but they all wrote the same thing. "I remember someone. And now I no longer feel alone because I still remember." Finally, she decided to self-publish the book. The first book was paperback, printed in monochrome, recycled paper, not elaborate, no promotion. But she sent it to every school in the area, every library, every family that she remembered once having children studying at Rose Hill. Then she quietly waited. Not everyone read it, but a few people called. A woman who used to be a substitute teacher at Rose Hill wrote her a letter. "I saw something wrong, but I was afraid. Now I read what you wrote. I cried all night. Thank you for not giving up." One morning in late April, as Laura was watering the plants, a boy of about 17 years old rode up on a bicycle. "Are you the one who wrote, 'Her name is Emma'?" he asked awkwardly. "Yes," Laura nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. He held out a book, the cover folded, with with a few ink stains. I read it. My sister is also named Emma. She died of illness last year. But I never dared to say anything. After reading your book, I feel like I'm allowed to remember. Laura squeezed his hand lightly. She didn't need to say anything more, because sometimes a small truth told correctly, at the right time, will become the last drop that awakens the entire ocean of oblivion. That evening, Laura stood in front of the old photo, holding a cup of tea. The weather was calm. The fireplace was warm. She poured more water into the second cup, as she had done thousands of times before. But this time, she said softly, "I told it." They heard it. Maybe not enough, but it has begun. Outside, the spring wind blew from the forest, bringing the sound of early birds, not clear from where, but no longer silent. And in the log cabin where the two sisters had grown up, a small piece of memory was no longer alone. On May 14th, Laura received a call from an unlisted number. She almost didn't answer it, but something in the long silence made her stop. And then the hoarse voice of a man rang out. Not noisy, not hasty, just a simple sentence like a stone thrown into a still lake. "Are you Emma Carter's sister?" Laura stood still in the kitchen. Her fingers clutched the table. "Yes. Who is calling?" Another moment of silence. "I used to be in ordinem noctis educatio, not at the bottom, nor at the top, but close enough to see everything." Laura squeezed the phone tightly. Her heart screamed hundreds of questions, but in the end, only one escaped into words. "Why?" the man continued. "I won't ask you to forgive me, but if you want to know, I'm willing to tell. I'm living in Portland. I won't run anymore." 3 days later, Laura sat opposite Walter Greaves, 81, former logistics advisor of ONE. The apartment he rented was a small place, nothing remarkable, like the man himself. But his eyes were different, not evasive, not fleeing, just tired. As if he had carried a chest full of darkness all his life, and now someone wanted to open it together. "Emma Carter," he began, "was one of the last." "The last of what?" Laura asked, her voice icy. "Of the campaign that I was in charge of transporting." Walter didn't beat around the bush. He told it in a monotonous voice as if reading an old report. After World War II, thousands of orphaned, uneducated, undocumented children roamed Europe. International organizations were set up to redistribute them, in the name of cross-continental educational opportunities. But in the shadows, human trafficking rings seized that opportunity. Organizations like ONE, under the guise of aid, were actually the place to gather, sort, and transfer children like goods. "So why transfer children from the U.S. to Europe?" Laura asked. "The U.S. doesn't lack schools." Walter looked at her. His eyes were no longer cloudy as when she entered. "Because when you take the goods out of the legal jurisdiction, you will wash away the origin, and when they return, no one can trace them anymore." Laura felt cold. "Emma wasn't an orphan," she said. "She had a family, had schools." "And that's what made her a risk," Walter replied. "We didn't want to take children with relatives, but sometimes there are mistakes. Or worse, experiments." "What experiments?" Walter slowly sipped water. His voice seemed to be sinking into a deeper layer of memory. "We used to collaborate with some medical and psychological research institutes. The purpose was to test the ability to erase young memories, affecting language and cognitive regions. They wanted to see if it was possible to rebuild a child without breaking the body." The room became stuffy. Laura clutched the arm of the chair, her lips pale. "And Emma?" Walter nodded slowly. "The girl resisted, not like the others. The night before being transferred, Emma discovered the observation room. She wrote on paper, hid it in toys, secretly attached a piece of metal under the bed." He looked at her. "And now I know. You found it." Laura didn't know what to feel. The rage had passed. Instead, there was a feeling like walking on a glass floor. Below was the abyss of memories of hundreds of children, not just Emma. "How many?" she asked. Walter didn't answer immediately. After a long time, he said softly, "We don't count names. Just count lots, and each lot is 12 children." "How many lots?" "At least 84. A quick calculation, nearly 1,000 children. Laura stood up. She didn't want to sit for another second in this room, but when she reached the door, Walter said a sentence that made her stop. "I remember Emma, not because she stood out, but because she looked straight at me, as if she trusted me, even though I didn't deserve it." That night, Laura didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the darkness, holding Emma's old notebook, where her 12-year-old sister had written the last lines before disappearing from history. The truth was clear. No more mysteries, no more hypotheses. And the most painful thing was, they didn't need a reason. They didn't take Emma because of hatred, because of personal schemes. They took her because she was number 11 in a batch, because she was the element needed to experiment with enough samples, because a machine had been allowed to operate too long in the dark without anyone questioning it. But also because of one more thing. Emma had resisted, and thanks to that, Emma had left a voice for her sister. Laura lit a small candle, placing it next to Emma's picture. She poured more water into 2 cups, as always, but this time she placed a small piece of paper under Emma's cup. The handwritten words in a steady slant, "I heard everything, and I promise, none of you will be forgotten anymore." Outside, the wind began to rise, but instead of cold, it brought the warmth of something moving, light, slow, but real. June. Exactly 34 years after Emma disappeared. Fairy Meadow had changed, or at least Laura felt so. No more silent walls, no more evasive eyes. Some people smiled when they saw her. Some called her the one who wrote the book about the truth. Once, in the supermarket, an unfamiliar little girl approached, asking in a real voice, "Miss, is Emma real?" Laura bent down, nodding. "Yes." And that baby was very brave. That was the first time in her life she realized Emma had been given back her name, not only in her sister's memory, but in the community's memory. That summer, Laura applied for permission from the town to build a small memorial in the forest outside Moonlight Point, where she had found the silver bracelet. She didn't demand anything big, just a stone bench, a simple stone pillar, and a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "For the children who were never allowed to return. Her name is Emma, and she is not forgotten." The town didn't object. Someone even volunteered to help build the stone pillar. A young carpenter contributed to making the bronze plaque. A class of high school students drew the symbol of 3 interlocking circles in white chalk on the day of the inauguration. No reporters, no media, just a few dozen people, a few cups of tea, a few whispered stories. But for Laura, it was the funeral that Emma deserved 34 years ago. A week later, Laura started working at the town library, where she had spent hours reading about humanitarian charities after the war. She was in charge of the Remembrance and Memory Corner, a small space containing stories submitted by the people. Not just about Emma, but about their grandfather who went to war, their grandmother who disappeared for a few weeks during the war, or the family cat who ran away for 3 days and then returned. A 10-year-old girl sent a handwritten letter. "My grandma says memories are not to be kept, but to be shared. Do you think so?" Laura smiled and wrote back, "I think memory is the thread connecting people who have never met, like you and Emma." On the last night of June, Laura returned to Moonlight Point alone, not for a memorial service, not for investigation, but just for a walk, carrying 2 cups of hot tea in a thermos and a blank notebook. When she arrived at the stone bench, she poured tea into 2 cups, one for herself, one placed in front. She opened the notebook, put the pen down. On the first page, she wrote, "If memory is a bridge, I hope you have crossed it today. I will stay on this side, telling the way. And wait, if one day someone else needs to find you. The forest wind blew lightly. The moon was not red, just clear and bright. But Laura knew the moonlight didn't have to be special to become a guide. A few days later, a girl of about 8 years old walked past the memorial with her mother. The girl stopped, pointed to the bronze plaque, reading each word aloud. "Her name is Emma," the girl's mother said softly. "A little girl who disappeared, a long time ago." The girl was silent for a moment, then bent down and picked up a small stone, placing it on the memorial. "I don't know her, but I think she would be happy if someone remembered her," the girl said softly, then continued walking. Behind, the small stone lay silently, but carrying more weight than any indictment. Because now, Emma had a place to return to, a name to be called, a person to be remembered. And so, the final answer did not come from the court, from the press, or from justice being granted, but it came from a sister who didn't let go, and a small memory kept with love.